If you're heading to Washington, D.C. soon and have an airplane fan in the family, you may have heard of the Air and Space Museum. But did you know that there are two? Let's talk about it. Hey there, this is Ashley, your host for the Ready, Set, Depart podcast. Do you want to make some memories and travel with your family? It's not as hard as you think. Let's go. Hello and welcome to episode 41 of the Ready, Set, Depart podcast. We are so glad you're here. I can already hear you thinking, wait, there are two Air and Space Museums in Washington, D.C.? Yes, there are, but the other one isn't as well known. But I think that should change. First, let's talk about Smithsonian Museums in 90 seconds or less. The Smithsonian Museums have an interesting history that starts with a man who never actually visited the United States. In 1829, an English scientist named James Smithson left his entire fortune to the United States to create an institution dedicated to, quote, the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Congress accepted the gift somewhat reluctantly because of the War of 1812 that was still fresh on many people's minds. But in 1846, the Smithsonian Institution was officially established. It all began with one building on the National Mall, often called the Castle. Over time, the Smithsonian grew into the world's largest museum, education, and research complex. Today, it includes 21 museums, the National Zoo, libraries, research centers, and millions of artifacts that preserve everything from natural history and art to space exploration and American culture. One of the best parts, most Smithsonian museums are completely free to visit, making them one of the greatest values for families traveling to Washington, D.C. Whether you're interested in airplanes, dinosaurs, gemstones, or American history, there's truly something for everyone. Both Air and Space Museums are part of the Smithsonian Institution, which means they're both free to visit and absolutely amazing. So, why are there two Air and Space Museums in Washington, D.C.? Well, to put it simply, planes are big, and they ran out of room. This year, 2026, the Air and Space Museum on the National Mall is celebrating 50 years. 50 years of flight, 50 years of visits, 50 years of collecting amazing planes and other artifacts. So by the 1990s, they had hundreds of aircraft that just sat in storage because they couldn't fit them in the museum how it was, and there was nowhere to expand on the mall. Here's a travel tip. The National Mall is not a shopping mall. It's an area of Washington, D.C. that is lined by museums and monuments. The old definition for mall was a tree-lined promenade. It's only recently that the term mall was used for shopping. While there are plenty of places to buy souvenirs on the mall, you won't find a J. Crew or Auntie Annie's anywhere. So, in 1993, Congress gave the Air and Space Museum permission to expand to a building near Dulles Airport in Chantilly, Virginia. It was the perfect location because there was plenty of room to grow. So, construction began in 2000, and by 2003, the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, so named because of a huge donation made by Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy, opened to the public. The Udvar-Hazy Center is about a 40-minute drive or about 2 hours by train and bus from Washington, D.C. So keep that in mind as we talk more about both museums. On the National Mall, you will find the Air and Space Museum. As with all of the museums on the mall, you'll have to go through airport-style security to enter the museum. With this museum, you'll also need a free timed ticket to enter. You can get those online beforehand or using a QR code at the museum, provided they still have tickets. When you enter, you'll be greeted by a huge display of airplanes, rockets, and satellites. Take a second to read about what you're seeing. Then you have a choice to make, left or right. To the right is the birth of airplanes, including the actual Wright Flyer. On the left is more modern airplanes and space exploration. And upstairs, you will find planes from World War I and World War II. Plus, keep your eye out for something from Star Wars that just might surprise you. Here's a travel tip. One of the things I love most about the Smithsonian Museums is what I like to call these, all in capital letters. The Wright Flyer, the hat that Abraham Lincoln wore, the Hope Diamond. For our family, that is the draw of our nation's capital. Here are some things to not miss when you're visiting the National Air and Space Museum. The Wright Flyer. That 12-second flight changed the world. And keep in mind that there's only 66 years between this first flight and the first person on the moon. The Apollo 11 Command Module Columbia. This is the capsule that carried Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins to the moon and back. The Spirit of St. Louis. This is the plane that Charles Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927. The Bell X-1 Glamorous Glennis. This is the rocket plane that Chuck Yeager piloted in 1947 when he became the first person to go faster than the speed of sound. A moon rock that you can touch. If you want to touch a piece of Mars, that's in Natural History Museum just across the mall. And friends, that's just scratching the surface. This museum just opened some new areas and they are much more hands-on than they used to be. Lots to learn about why flight works, which is pretty cool. Now for me, the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center is what I think of when I think of an airplane museum. You walk in and you look out over a huge 3-part hangar that houses hundreds of airplanes, both on the ground and in the air. If you're driving, keep in mind that while the museum is free, parking is not. If you're taking public transportation, you'll need to time your trip to catch the bus that only goes out to the museum once an hour. This is where Google Maps would come in super handy. Here are the must-sees in the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. The Space Shuttle Discovery. For a kid who grew up in the height of the space shuttle era, this is by far my favorite thing in the museum. It is amazing to look at it and think that this has been in outer space. You can see where the heat shield went through the fire of re-entry. It is just plain old cool. And the way they have it set up is perfect for pictures. Here's a travel tip. If you want the perfect selfie with the Discovery behind you, go up to the second walkway in front of the Discovery. It's a great picture spot. You'll see the SR-71 Blackbird. This is Trooper's favorite. This plane still holds the speed record of over 3 times the speed of sound, and it was made in the 60s. The Enola Gay. I didn't know what this was when I first went to the museum, but I could tell it was something to see by the hushed tones people used around it. It's the plane that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima at the end of World War II. The Concorde. Brent always smiles when he sees this plane. It could fly from New York to London in about 3 hours, where it normally takes like 8. Unfortunately, they no longer fly the Concorde because of a horrific crash in 2000 that hit the company hard. Then 9/11 came, and they just couldn't survive. But you can definitely imagine how cool it would be to leave New York in the morning and be having tea in London the same day. The Restoration Hangar. Want to watch historic aircraft being restored? This is the place to go. There are windows all around the Restoration Hangar, and they often have notes about what they're doing. Don't miss it. But again, this is just scratching the surface. There are literally hundreds of airplanes there, tucked in under bigger airplanes or suspended from the ceiling. It's a great place. Here's a travel tip. There's an X-Wing fighter jet, a la Star Wars, that actually flies there. Okay, well, it's a drone that is dressed up as an X-Wing. But when they opened the Star Wars section of Walt Disney World, this drone flew over Batuu. I wish we could have seen that. But it's still pretty fun to see now. Now to answer a few questions that you might be thinking. What are the biggest differences? One word, space. The Air and Space Museum in DC just doesn't have anywhere near the space that the Udvar-Hazy one does. And the Udvar-Hazy one has room to grow, so that's never going to change. Who is each museum best for? The Air and Space Museum in DC is for the casual airplane junkie. The Wright Flyer is pretty cool to see, but it's not as dramatic as the Udvar-Hazy Museum. If you have a family member who loves planes, who stops whenever they hear a plane, who notices that they in fact change the kinds of planes they fly in Top Gun, then the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center is for them. They will be entranced. I know this because this describes Brent, and this is one of his favorite places. But if you only have a day, which I get because there is so much to see and do in Washington, D.C., if you only have a day, stay on the mall and go to the Air and Space Museum. It's a cool museum, and before we went to the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, I would have left it at that. What a cool museum. But now there's a but in that sentence. Can you do both? Absolutely. But you'll spend the whole day at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center between getting there and the sheer size of it. So what's my recommendation? I want to preface this with, I married an airplane enthusiast who is slowly converting Trooper to his ways. But my favorite of the two is Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. It is awe-inspiring. There is enough to keep me intrigued right along with them. And the shuttle is really, really, really cool. So my recommendation would be this. The Air and Space Museum in DC is cool, but the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center is a hidden gem right next to the airport. But really, if you only have time for one museum, I don't think you can make a bad choice. The Air and Space Museum is iconic. It's home to some of the most important artifacts in aviation and space history, and it's right on the National Mall. But if you have even half a day to spare and don't mind driving out to Dulles Airport, I really think the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center is worth the trip. Standing underneath the Space Shuttle Discovery, seeing Concorde up close, looking at the SR-71 Blackbird. It's an experience that's really hard to put into words. And honestly, I think that's what makes both of these museums so special. They don't just tell the story of flight, they let you stand in the presence of the machines that changed history. Whether you visit one or both, I don't think you'll leave disappointed. That's all I have for you today. And as always, let's keep making traveling with your family easier, one trip at a time. See you next time. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, be sure to share it with your friends or even leave us a review so others can find it. Follow us on Instagram at Ready Set Depart Podcast. This is Ashley with Ready Set Depart. Remember, traveling with your family and making memories is not as hard as you think. See you next time.